All right, it was necessary to take a quick break, so let's jump right back into it. Thesis Project Academy, the next thing that we're going to go over is some preliminaries, some broad overview things about a thesis project. And so if you're in the beginning of the journey, some of this will be new information to you or things you've kind of heard. If you have finished a couple of years of D-Min work, this is going to be largely overview, so skip ahead if you need to. But I'm hoping that the information will be useful to everybody watching. Just as a real starting point, what is a thesis project? This is a very important point of clarification. A thesis project is very different than a PhD thesis. It's different than research papers you've written in the past. It's certainly quite a bit different probably than a lot of your master's level work. As I was looking back on the last time I did something in my education that was like a thesis project, I want to say it was high school science. And that's because I had to learn about a subject in depth, and then I had to do an experiment with measurements, and then I had to, make little charts and tables, and then I had to write what I learned. That is the closest picture to a thesis project. So if some of you are imagining a thesis paper or a research paper, or even what PhDs do, which is a thesis paper, which is basically a lot of book research, you're going to be missing the point here. A thesis project is a project. It works with people, it's measurable, and it does have theory, and it does have research elements, but that leads us to do something with measurement, and it should be within the field of ministry, or broadly speaking, contribute to the craft of living out the Christian life, or in some ways, some leadership elements. You can do this in the secular world with business for sure. You can do it in education as well, but basically we're taking biblical truths, we're taking theory, and we're applying them to a context, and we are measuring something, and we are learning. This is a thesis project. It is not the same thing as a PhD thesis, a research paper, or any kind of term paper that you're used to. So if this is your first orientation on what a thesis project is, you really need to crumple up the idea of just a research kind of paper and realize you're doing some kind of experiment, investigative work that builds data. That's what we're doing. But let me take this a couple of steps further. So beyond what is a thesis project, I like to think, and I'm not sure if others would use these kind of terms, you can use them if they're helpful to you, but when I do any sort of thesis work, whether I'm just kind of coaching a student in a one session or actually, kind of doing some contract basis coaching, I like to think of a thesis projects in one of two categories. The first one we'll call a discovery thesis project or an investigative thesis project. And this is where we want to uncover why something is happening. This could be a rather toxic context that you're trying to learn what's happening in this church, what's happening in this school, what's happening in this business that things are not going well. And you would do interviews or you distribute surveys and you're trying to uncover the real problem. That would be a discovery or an investigative. Or in a totally different kind of project, you go study the super successful model and you're trying to distill principles. Or maybe you're comparing groups and trying to figure out what the commonalities are. But that is basically discovery or investigative work. And that would be an awesome thesis project that can contribute to the craft of ministry. Well, another kind, besides the discovery or investigative model over here, the other kind would be an experimental thesis project. And that is where, based on your theory and what the work you've done in research, you want to do something. You want to implement something, or you want to fix something, or you want to maybe start a new program. There's plenty of thesis projects that I can rattle off. One, a guy wanted to institute new prayer programs in his church to see if they changed unity. So that's what he did. He had a project where he instituted prayer programs and he measured unity pre and post with some assessments to see, did adding more prayer elements bring greater unity to the church? Did adding spiritual formation assessments, and this would be in a second study, to Corbin students, and having two groups of Corbin students, some who were discipled by a teacher and some who were just in regular classes, and comparing the two groups. Did the element of adding discipling from teachers, did that lead to greater spiritual formation? That would be an experiment. It would be you actually, based on theory, I think discipleship works, implementing something and measuring it with a group and sometimes with a control group for comparison. So those are, broadly speaking, two kinds of thesis projects: discovery thesis projects and experimental ones. And as you will see, you can do in a problem, in a context of ministry, you can come up with discovery ideas or experimental ones, and we have to discern which one works best and which one you are best able to do. So what are the two types of data that we collect? If you are familiar with social sciences, we're just basically gathering quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative data usually comes from interviews and asking people questions and allowing them to freely tell us information. And those are really important in discovery thesis if we're trying to figure out the reasons why things are happening, whether they are good or bad. Those would be usually the result of interviews. Qualitative. On the other side is quantitative, usually thinking of numbers and analytics and graphs. And quantitative usually comes from asking questions or doing assessments that are Likert scale, bubble 1 to 5, where 1 is I don't agree and 5 is I totally agree. And people fill those out, and the end result is that we have a bunch of numbers that we can calibrate and put into tables, and that is quantitative. Those are the two types of data that we collect in these projects. And we use them in different projects, and we use them differently. I ask this question, but admittedly it's a bad question. What is an average project? An average project is that there is somebody in the class who works or lives somewhere who sees some problem or something they want to improve, and they figure out, do I want to discover the problem, or do I want to go discover somebody who's doing this better and learn from them? Or do I want to experiment and implement something and set it up so that I can measure before I've started, maybe in the middle of me doing it, and at the end to see, did this thing work? And what you're going to find out is that there's a lot of things happening in the church and the business world that nobody really measures. And when you don't measure anything, we don't really know if things work or are effective. But the average thesis project is going to be either experimental or discovery. It's probably going to come out of your place of ministry or your place of work. And it's either going to be a problem to be solved or an opportunity usually, or a hunch or question that you have. When it comes to how long these papers are, that's for a future video. We'll get to it. But if you need a ballpark, let's just say 200 to 250 pages is what you write. But don't be alarmed. A lot of this is going to be you describing the project that you did. And so as you will find, chapters 2 and 3 are challenging, but chapters 1, 4, 5, and 6 can actually come pretty easily. But we'll get to all of that a little bit later. So I think that's going to set up our next question. What are the 6 chapters of the thesis project? Yes, the thesis project is a large paper that you write, and again, you write it after you have done work in the real world that is measured, of course. But you write chapter 1, what is the problem and why you want to address it? This is all the talk about the problem of ministry, the rationale. Why does this problem exist? How can you prove the problem exists? Etc., etc. Chapter 2 is the biblical theology chapter, and that's where you want to think about what does the scriptures contribute to this topic. Is there things that are precedent there that I want to uncover to find principles or parameters? Chapter 3 is what's called the literature review. And basically, some aspect of your project, some theme or main idea therein, you're going to want to study to figure out what has already been written on this topic. What is already out there that you can sort, organize, and demonstrate that you know what's going on in that field so that your project adds to it. For example, if you wanted to create your own, maybe you had an opportunity to kind of start a mentoring program. Well, your chapter 2 might talk about the biblical theological side of mentoring and how that's demonstrated or seen in scriptures. But your chapter 3 might be an assessment of existing mentoring programs that are out there. That would be a literature review. And so that's where we get into some of those research or original theory kinds of things. That's going to come out in chapter 3. Chapter 4, by the way, is a discussion of what you intend to do. Future, writing future tense of what you will do with your project. Chapter 5 is what you actually did in your project. And chapter 6 is what you learned from your project, conclusion and results. And so that is a thesis project paper, 6 chapters. And brothers and sisters, I think that we are now ready to move on to the next video, video 2, which I know this is the second video. It's video 1, part 2. But we're now going to move into the PlayPosit. The PlayPosit website, which is going to be that interactive thing where I'm going to give you a real world situation and ask you questions and have you respond. And hopefully through that engagement and kind of going through different contexts, getting you onto that football field, getting you in the game, you will learn some skills about thesis thinking. Thanks for taking the time to watch both of these introductory videos, and please let me know if you need any help with anything. Blessings.